everyone. All right, so we are picking up with Immanuel Kant, and we're going to go over the Metaphysics of Morals, which we discussed on Monday. Mm, and we're going to go into a little more detail about a number of the key ideas here. So let's just remind ourselves a little bit about um, Kant's metaphysical outlook, right? Which is important for understanding the idea of the moral law, the idea of really his whole moral philosophy. So, to put it really um, simply, for Kant, there are essentially two parts of human experience and human being. There is the part of human being that is engaged in the realm of phenomena, engaged in the physical world, uh, the part of human being that has a practical being, right? That is concerned with purposes, doing things, making things happen, achieving things, action. Uh, and there's another part of human being which is engaged in pure reason and entirely outside of the physical realm and away from action, is able to contemplate the universal laws that organize and structure our reality. Now, what's important is to grasp that this realm of pure reason is the foundation for reality. That our rationality, our access to pure reason, and the extent to which we have pure reason, is what allows us to have experience, right? The condition for the possibility of experience. So, pure reason is the source of physical laws, the source of reality. However, within the physical realm, uh, that pure reason is I want to say, not compromised, but diluted, as it were. We don't get our sense of pure reason from observing the world. We get it through reflection, through pure thought. All right. As long as we keep in mind that pure reason is something entirely removed from the physical world, and that it is transcendental, we'll be all right. Now, we think about the moral law. We would, as we said in class on Monday, put it in direct opposition to both Aristotelian and utilitarian ethics. The moral law for Kant is not going to be based on experience or the particular situation. The moral law derives from pure reason and is transcendental, meaning it is that which provides the structure for reality, not something that is gleaned through experience of reality. So let's look at the text. And it's difficult to talk about Kant's metaphysics without having read any of that work. We get a little bit in the Metaphysics of Morals, but not enough to really provide us with the foundation that we need. So let's just accept what we have, our understanding for now, and get into the text. So Kant begins, as we mentioned by stating that nothing in the world or outside of it can be considered good except for the goodwill, right? Nothing in the world or out of it can possibly be conceived that could be called good without qualification except a good will. So, right, another important point of difference between Kantian deontology and utilitarianism or virtue ethics is that for Kant, uh, the only thing that matters, the only thing that can be considered good or ethical, is the will, right? The motive. Right? One's actions are not good without qualification because they are part of the phenomenal world, part of the physical world. Right? Action necessarily occurs within physicality. And therefore, action is going to be determined by uh, a whole host of universal laws. And we'll look at this in some more detail in a minute, why action is not good in itself. For the same reason, consequences are not going to be good in themselves because they will be determined not by one's pure rationality, but by the physical laws, the conditions of the physical world, by the circumstances, which are not in themselves determined by the moral law. So that the only thing that is good, that can be good without qualification, is one's motive, right? Is the goodwill, the will to do good. And the reason for this is that the will comes from that pure rationality. The will is able to act according to a rational principle. One is able to will a rational principle, even if one is not able to enact a rational principle. Right? So I can imagine that I would act with a good motive. My motive would be pure, would be in line with and motivated by the moral law, this transcendental idea of good. But that when I actually act, the action itself is, occurs within physical consequences, and therefore will be shaped by things other than just that pure moral law. I'm motivated by the moral law. I wish my action to be in accordance with the moral law, but my action itself is going to be shaped by my physical surroundings. And when the pure will transcends into the physical realm, when it takes on a physical character, it becomes physicalized, temporalized. It gets put into a context, and it must, again, follow other laws than just the moral law, and therefore will be diverted, perhaps, from its motive. The act is impure by virtue of being physical, whereas the will can be pure because it is functioning out of this pure rationality, transcending from pure rationality into the physical realm. The consequences of an action will be nothing but physical consequences. It will be determined entirely by the laws of physics. And so the moral law will, at the very least, be invisible at the level of consequences. Consequences will be determined only by physical laws, right? So, again, if we think about the example of rushing into a burning building, now, let's say my motive is to save a life. Right? Now, whether or not that follows the moral law, we can think about that more in a minute, but let's say it does. As soon, right, so my motive is pure. My motive is good. I'm motivated by a good will, the will to save a life. However, as soon as I act, my action is compromised by all of these external considerations, these qualifications. Right? To what extent am I physically able to rush into the building and save a life? Right? Perhaps my own body will betray my will, my ability to follow through on the moral law. Perhaps my body is sound, but circumstances aren't going to allow things to play out the way I intended. Right? I rush into the building and things don't go as expected. And so, even if I were capable of it, I fail to achieve what I meant to. And so, uh, all of the goals, right, the purposes of the action are essentially irrelevant. Whether or not I'm able to actually fulfill the moral law is not within my control, right? Because that will depend on physical circumstances. However, my willingness to act according to the moral law is constrained by nothing. I am able to will myself to act according to the moral law, and for Kant, that is my duty. That is an imperative. So, very differently from Aristotle, the good won't be determined based on an evaluation of the circumstances, but will be absolute, and I will have a duty to attempt to live according to the moral law. And if I am ethical, I will follow the moral law, even if it is detrimental to me, right? Even if it means that it won't make me happy and may even result in my death. Right? It will be the correct thing to do to rush into the burning building, even if I know that that means certain death for me. Right? So this is why, for Kant, happiness is not a consideration of ethics, and why action is not what should be considered. Right? That one's ability to perform an action, or whether or not the action is in itself a good action, is not important. Right? Your ethics, one's ethics, ethics in general, can only be said to be good if they are derived from an universal and absolute transcendental concept of the good. And so the will, motive is the only thing that matters. And so, we saw this in utilitarianism in Mill also. This means that Aristotelian idea of virtue is not important, right? Is irrelevant. And Kant puts this more explicitly, that the virtues are not inherently good, not good in themselves, not good without qualification. He writes on page 5, moderation in emotions and passions, self-control, and calm deliberation not only are good in many ways, but seem even to constitute part of the person's inner worth. And they were indeed unconditionally valued by the ancients. Right? So moderation, self-control, deliberation, these are Aristotelian terms. Yet, he goes on, they are very far from being good without qualification, good in themselves, good in any circumstances. For without the principles of a good will, they can become extremely bad. For example, a villain's coolness makes him far more dangerous and more straightforwardly abominable to us than he would otherwise have seemed, right? So the moderate, deliberate, are ethical, but in fact less ethical, right? Those virtues that make a person excellent can also be applied uh, to right, immoral ends. We saw this, right? Courage is required of the thief, of the murderer. So these virtues are too relative for Kant, and this is something that Mill picks up also. However, uh, Kant is going to separate himself even further from those ancient virtues and from Mill and utilitarianism by saying that also right, ethics isn't about happiness. Not only is it not about virtue or cultivating a virtuous character, but that happiness is not about, I'm sorry, that morality is not about happiness at all. Uh, so, ethics is about the goodwill, and the only way to be ethical, to be moral, is to bring one's will in line with the moral law, with absolute morality. So, in general, then, um, we get a different definition of the human being with Kant. Kant understands the moral subject, the human subject, to be something different than it's conceived in Aristotle. Right? We remember from Aristotle that the human being is the zoon, logon, eshon, the rational animal, the animal endowed with speech, the capacity for true speech. For Aristotle, right, the human being is an equal mix of body and mind. Uh, you know, it's impossible to separate the human being from their physical context, from their body and their physical surroundings. For Kant, the human being is human. Everything that makes us human is outside of our physicality, is removed from the physical world. Right? Our humanity, our capacity to be moral, our will, and our rationality are divorced from the physical world. So for Kant, the human is not a rational animal, but is what he calls an autonomous rational agent. So we still have that word rational, but we are not rational animals, and rationality is not conceived as speech or giving a true account. Instead, rationality is the capacity to understand universal rational laws, right? The concepts of pure reason. Rationality means having access to transcendental rationality, a rationality that exists outside of and is the foundation for physicality. So we have this transcendental element in us, which is our rationality. And that is the seat of our humanity. We're rational, but we are also autonomous agents. Agents meaning we are capable of being a cause. We are able to cause things to happen in the physical world. Now, this is an extremely complicated point for Kant, because in his Metaphysics, everything in the physical world is determined by universal rational laws, like gravity, like the laws of motion, like the laws of thermodynamics, the laws of physics. Everything that happens in the physical world is determined according to these necessary, absolute universal laws of physics. Nothing can interrupt these laws. Right? So Kant is dealing with a deterministic universe. He's thinking about, in the context of modern philosophy, he is attempting, on the one hand, to hold up a scientific view of the world, right? That nature proceeds according to the laws of physics. These are absolute. If this is true, that everything in nature is determined according to the laws of physics, then there can be no freedom. There can be no human freedom, nor any other kind of freedom. There can be no contingency. Everything that happens is necessary because it follows from these unbreakable physical laws. If we think about this, what is this worldview? We'd say everything that happens for a reason. Everything that happens has a cause. Every cause produces an effect Every cause has an effect, and the effect follows necessarily from the cause. Right? If I hit the pool cue into the 8-ball, right, the 8-ball is going to move as a result of being hit by the cue ball necessarily. There is no avoiding this. Right? It's a necessary law of motion. If we think that everything in nature is determined according to similar necessary causal laws, then everything that happens in nature and everything that has happened in the history of nature is a necessary effect of some cause as necessary as the 8-ball moving when the cue ball hits it. So that if we imagine the beginning of the universe, say the Big Bang, we'd say the Big Bang begins a chain reaction. And everything that happens within that chain reaction is determined by necessary laws. So that as the universe develops, everything that develops will develop as a result of those laws. If you had a God's eye perspective, if you were omniscient, if you were all-knowing, you would be able, knowing all physical laws and everything that was in existence, you would be able to determine exactly how everything in nature would develop and unfold. So that at the moment of creation, the first cause of the universe, you would be able to determine, if you were omniscient, the entire history of the universe down to the smallest detail. Because everything that occurs will be a necessary effect of the first cause and the laws that govern the universe. From a scientific perspective, the human being is nothing more than part of nature. Human being is a physical thing that is, just like everything else in nature, determined by those necessary laws. As physical things, therefore, we have no freedom. Everything we do is determined by the laws of physics. There is no free will from a physicalistic perspective. Kant, wanting to uphold that scientific worldview and affirm the universal laws of physics, also affirms this world, right? A physical world in which there is no human freedom. However, on the other hand, he wants to assert that there is human freedom, that humans do have free will and the ability to act as not to act, right? To act as a cause, to be something more than mere effects of physical laws. To assert that we are rational agents is to assert that we are able to act as causes, that an individual human can act not just as an effect, is not just an effect of the physical world, but is able to interrupt the chain of cause and effect that is determined by universal physical laws and act as a cause in itself. The human can act as a cause in itself. And the only way these two worldviews, the one in which everything is determined by universal physical laws, the other in which there is human freedom, the only way these two laws are compatible, these two worlds are compatible, is by asserting that the human being has access to this otherworldly realm of pure reason, a transcendental realm, which is itself responsible for the rational structure of the physical world. And that's what Kant is doing with this idea of a priori concepts of pure reason, right? To say what gives the world this rational structure is pure reason. And we are able to access the structure of the world because we have access to pure reason. We are able to access that because we are ourselves transcendental beings that have one foot in the realm of phenomena, in the physical world, and one foot in the realm of pure reason. So our capacity to act as a cause, our capacity to have free will, comes from this realm of pure reason. Therefore, we can only act as a cause, we can only act as free agents when we are acting on principles of pure reason, from pure reason. Whenever we act because of any other motive, we are not acting as free agents, but as determined physical bodies. We are acting within the laws of physics, not freely. And so, when I decide to eat, that act is not a free act. I've been determined to eat by the laws of physics of my body. I'm hungry, I eat. When I pursue pleasure, or happiness. I am, again, as we discussed on Monday, acting from instinct. Right? I desire pleasure. I desire a certain kind of happiness or any particular kind of outcome. I do that because I've been caused to desire that by my circumstances. Any goal within the physical world will be a goal that is determined by the laws of physics, by the physical world. And I, in my pursuit of it, am acting as a determined being, not a free being. What gives me pleasure? What makes me happy? These are not things that I freely choose. And so my pursuit of them is not free either. I can only act freely when I act on something that lies outside of the physical world, things that are determined by physical laws. And so the only thing that I can act freely on, the only alternative to being determined by physical causes, is to act according to the moral law, right? Now, this puts us in a strange position because I also don't choose what the moral law is. And so my choice, such as it is whether I will be determined by the laws of physics and the physical circumstances that cause me to pursue pleasure or happiness or any kind of practical goal, or if I choose to be determined by those pure rational principles that exist outside of the physical realm, which are transcendental. In both cases, I am determined by some law, the law of physics, the laws of nature, or the laws of reason and morality. My freedom lies in choosing which I will be determined by. And the only way to know which of those you're determined by is through your will. Do you will yourself to follow the moral law or not? Kant is interesting about this. He says, right, we can never know ultimately if we are caused to act by the moral law or the physical laws. All I can know is if I have willed myself, if I wish myself to be ruled by rational principles and moral law rather than my physical circumstances. So on page 8, he gives us an example. Take the example of a shopkeeper who charges the same prices for selling his goods to inexperienced customers as for selling them to anyone else, right? So a shopkeeper who charges all people the same price. That would be the moral thing to do, right? To follow a rational principle, a universal law. All people are charged the same price. Kant writes, this is in accord with duty. But there is also a prudential and not duty-based motive that the shopkeeper might have for this course of conduct. When there is a buyer's market, he may sell as cheaply to children as to others so as not to lose customers. Thus the customer is honestly served, but we can't infer from this that the shopkeeper has behaved in this way from duty and principles of honesty. So I might never lie, right? As we discussed on Monday, and we'll go into that again in a minute, I might never lie. And that would be fulfilling my moral duty. That would be acting and willing according to the moral law. However, there are a lot of reasons why I might never lie. I might be afraid of being caught. I might recognize that someone who never lies is more trustworthy, and people who are more trustworthy, have more friends and are more successful. So the only thing I can be sure of is that it is my motivation. Right? And even then, Kant thinks, I can't be totally sure. Right? I might tell myself that my motive is to follow the moral law, but I might secretly, he says, be motivated by self-interest, practical concerns. So the best we can do is know the moral law and will the moral law, and by willing the moral law, we do as much as we can to be in line with the moral law. All right, now the final part of this formulation of the human being, autonomous rational agent, is this idea of autonomy. Right? That the human being is autonomous. And this means self-ruled, right? Autonomy. Nomos is the Greek word for rule. Autos is self. So the self-ruled rational agent, right? The moral agent, rational moral agent that is self-determined. And what this means is not that we decide what the good is, but that no one can direct our will except ourselves. That we have autonomous control over our will. And as we'll see, this is key to the second formulation of the categorical imperative, right, which is to treat other people as ends in themselves, never as only a means to an end. Right? That every person is a person to the extent that they act autonomously. So that when I manipulate someone, or when I treat someone as an object, as a means to my own end, I'm not treating them as autonomous, right? I'm not respecting their autonomy, allowing them to direct their own will. I'm manipulating their will. I am, right, denying an essential part of their humanity. So an autonomous rational agent is the idea here. Okay, now on Monday we talked a little bit about the categorical imperative, but let's review this again. For Kant, there are two kinds of imperatives, and the imperatives correspond to the two realms in which humanity dwells, right? The phenomenal realm and the realm of pure reason. We have, on the one hand, a hypothetical imperative. A hypothetical imperative is an imperative that tells you what you need to do in order to get something. What are the means to my end? Right, what do I need to do in order to achieve my goals in the practical realm? In order to get a good job, I need to go to college, I need to get good grades, I need to have work experience, etc. I do all those things because hypothetically, those will lead to my end goal of getting a job. Right? It's hypothetical because, right, we imagine that if I do X, I will get Y. There's no guarantee of that, and it all happens within the practical realm, which I do not have control over. So it's hypothetical because there's no guarantee, and because it's in the practical realm. The categorical imperative comes from this realm of pure reason and is categorical because it's universal. Just as categorically things fall to earth, the categorical imperative should be as absolute and universal. The categorical imperative does not say, in order to get X, you must do Y. Categorical imperative is indifferent to all goals and purposes, at least all goals and purposes that belong to an individual, right, that are derived from self-interest, or even collective interest, the collective interest of a country or a religious group or a city, right, a school. Rather, the categorical imperative is satisfied, again, simply through the will. If I have willed the categorical imperative, then I have achieved the goal of the categorical imperative. Right? In willing the categorical imperative, I have already reached my goal. I have become good. I have brought myself in line with the moral law. So there is no further consequence, not at the individual level, to pursuing the moral law. And maybe at the end we'll have a chance to talk about the larger purpose of the moral law. Certainly we'll be able to talk about that in class on Monday. But the important point is to recognize the categorical imperative has no benefit for you as an individual. Now, what are these categorical imperatives? What is the moral law? What does reason dictate is the universal good? That's the question. What does reason dictate is the universal good? For Kant, the way to find this out, right, is with the idea of willing a maxim, right? That the categorical imperative says, I ought never to act in such a way that I couldn't also will that the maxim on which I act should be a universal law. He writes on page 11. Right? So to do what is universalizable, as I put it in class, to act on that maxim that can be universalized, right? That I could will that my action would be done by all people in all places. So by necessity, this is going to be abstract. Right? It would be the moral law says, be courageous, or don't steal. Not in that specificity, right? It's not going to give you that content. Instead, it's going to offer a form of behavior which can be applied to all situations. So the first, as I said in class, right, there are two formulations of the categorical imperative. First is to, right, only act in on those maxims that you will to be a universal law, to do what is universalizable. Let's look at this example just quickly. Again, the sort of flagship example will be lying. Right? That I'm able to will that all people at all times in all situations should tell the truth. And I'm unable to will that all people should lie. The reason is that the structure of the lie cannot be universalized. Reason dictates that the lie cannot be universalized. Were everyone to lie at all times in all places, as we discussed, the lie would fail to work. It would fail to function as a lie. The lie deteriorates. It self-destructs when it becomes universalized. So, right, we can see this idea, of universalization. There are a few other examples, right? Kant says there's also right, a universal moral law against suicide, that it would always be immoral to commit suicide, that it is logically incoherent to commit suicide, and therefore that reason dictates that it is immoral to commit suicide. And his reasoning is that the reason to commit suicide is the desire to escape pain and to find, therefore, pleasure. That what one seeks in suicide is a respite from pain, but that suicide is logically incoherent because in seeking to remove pain, one eradicates that which is capable of feeling pain or pleasure. That the being that wants to not feel pain is erased through this suicide, right? So that the idea is the human being desires something. And suicide does not deliver what is desired. In fact, it erases the capacity for desire. Right? I desire to not feel pain. What I get from suicide is the destruction of desire itself. And so that desire cancels itself, destroys itself. It structurally is contradictory. So, in the same way that the lie is inherently self-contradictory when universalized, suicide is also. All right, we'll talk a little bit more about other sort of specific moral imperatives that Kant mentions in a minute, but I want to talk about the second form of the categorical imperative, which is to treat human beings as means to an end, as ends in themselves, never as a means to an end. On page 29, he writes, act in such a way as to treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of anyone else, always as an end and never merely as a means. And so we talked about, this. What this means is that I can never use someone as a means to my own ends. I can never objectify them. I can never exploit them, and I can never, constrain them. So I mentioned in class that there is a way of interpreting Kantian ethics to say that they are an other-oriented ethics, an ethics that considers the other person prior to considering oneself. The other person is the subject of ethics, not myself. The point of ethics is to take care of others, to look out for the relationship between myself and others, and not to make myself happy or to achieve my goals, something like that. So there's a 20th century philosopher named Jean-Paul Sartre, who in a play called No Exit writes a very famous line, says, "Hell is other people." One thing he means by this is that other people are always getting in the way. Other people are always preventing me from doing what I like, right? They constrain me. Other people constrain me. I have to take them into consideration. I have to fight them sometimes. Other people disagree with me about what we should do, about what is good, about what's right, about how we should organize society, or how I should live my life even. This is the whole work of politics, is negotiating these competing and conflicting claims about the good, what we ought to do. Other people are not just a constraint, but a torment, in the sense that they challenge me not just in terms of my ability to pursue and get what I want, but also in my ability to think and to know. They challenge my understanding. And so other people can be a source of frustration. They can be, as Sartre said, hell. Kantian ethics is not. I think this is really an important and interesting point, because Kant is such a universalist, right? He's looking for universal moral laws and an absolute moral law. But what he's not saying is that everyone has to have the same idea of a practical good, that everyone has to agree on what the good is in the practical realm, that we should all agree. No, that's not the point. In fact, the moral law dictates that not only is it inevitable that we will not disagree, but morality lies only in allowing others to pursue their own ends. Sure, try to persuade others, have debate, deliberate about the good, discuss in that Aristotelian sense, in that Arendtian sense. But one is not allowed, under any circumstances, to, for example, prevent someone from speaking, to silence someone, to prevent them from pursuing their own ends, to murder someone, to prevent them from doing something, to enslave someone, to prevent them from doing something, or in other ways to exploit or oppress others, right? All of that would very much go against this second formulation of the categorical imperative. So Kant's universalism is not aimed, at least in any kind of short term, at universal agreement. Rather, the only agreement among people is not important. Rather, each individual, each autonomous agent, needs to bring themselves into agreement with the moral law. And in so doing, they will be in agreement with one another that each person has the right to pursue their own ends, develop their own concept of the good, pursue their own happiness. So, in this sense, Kant's morality is absolutely in line with liberal democracy and liberalism in general, capitalism also, right? That free speech, free enterprise, these are conditions under which each is able to pursue their own idea of the good. The liberal democratic value of tolerance, right? Whether that's initially religious tolerance, tolerance of other nations, and then right in the 20th century we get that idea adapted for racial tolerance, or in the 19th century that's adapted as racial tolerance. You find that also in the 18th century. That idea of tolerance, right? That morality dictates that one tolerate others who are different. So morality, Kant's morality, leaves space for otherness, for those who will be other than you and who will disagree with you. And the moral law states that you must respect them as ends in themselves. Now, these moral imperatives, these two formulations of the categorical imperative, are a duty, Kant thinks. We have a duty to respect the categorical imperative and to follow it. This idea of duty is very important for Kant. Now, where does this duty come from? Why do we have a sense of duty to the moral law, categorical imperative? Duty is born from a sense, again, of respect. And the respect that Kant has in mind here is respect for the law, respect for the moral law. And I think we can think about this in terms of, right, well, what about this moral law commands respect? In general, what is respect and what commands respect? Why do we feel compelled to respect certain things and less compelled to respect others, or in some cases, feel no duty to respect certain things? Right? The kind of respect that Kant starts with is respect for rationality. And I think we can think about respect for the moral law in the same way that we think about respect for truth. When I recognize something true, for example, let's say I misunderstand something. Say I misunderstand a math problem. I've been doing a math problem wrong my whole life. Right? I haven't understood how to correctly do a math problem. I don't necessarily know, I don't know that my method is wrong, that I've been doing math wrong. But if someone comes and corrects me, shows me the correct way to do it, and then explains why it's correct, and then I see and understand why it's correct, if I come to an understanding of that correctness, What I've hit on is I've brought myself into alignment with the rational law that dictates how mathematics works. When I encounter something true, something rational, the truth commands respect. When I see the correct way to do the math problem, I immediately recognize that it's correct. I recognize the truth of it. And that recognition, saying, yes, that is correct. I recognize that truth. That is respect. So the same is true of the moral law. When I recognize that reason dictates certain moral principles, Kant thinks, I am compelled, I feel a duty based on my innate respect for reason to follow that moral law. It doesn't mean I always will. It doesn't mean I will always be moral or will the moral law. It means that I recognize the validity, the truth of the moral law. And just as I'm perfectly capable of going back to doing the math problem wrong, I will now know that it's wrong. And I will feel either silly, ridiculous, or stupid, or bad, right? As in intentionally misbehaving when I do the math problem incorrectly again. And that is the presence of this respect for truth. I know what I'm doing is wrong. And that knowing that what you're doing is wrong is the recognition of the reality of those universal laws. Right? So we remember we were discussing the fact that the moral law doesn't make you happy, and indeed that one who knows the moral law develops misology, a hatred of reason, because the moral law often forces us to go against what's in our interest or what we desire. Our conscience tells us that we are doing something immoral because it respects inherently the moral law, and it feels that duty to abide by the moral law, which is born out of this respect. So our conscience, when it tells us that we're doing something wrong, is reminding us that we have a duty compelled by our innate respect for truth and our innate sort of understanding of this moral law. Now, duty for Kant comes in two kinds. He says we have perfect duties and imperfect duties. A perfect duty is dictated by the moral law. And my perfect duty is to follow the categorical imperative, right? To do what is universalizable and to treat people as ends in themselves. I have a perfect duty, meaning, again, I have a duty at all times, in all places, to follow the moral law, and all people do. There are, however, Kant thinks, also imperfect duties. Duties that are based in the categorical imperative, based in the moral law, but which are not the moral law itself. Imperfect duties, because one does not have a duty to follow them at all times in all places, and not everyone has to follow them all the time. So the two main kinds of imperfect duties are, one, to help other people. And the second would be to develop one's talents. So the first imperfect duty, to help others. It is, Kant says, obviously a good thing to help other people. And in many cases, right, in the practical realm, helping others is good, obviously. Moreover, because I am the same as other people in terms of my rational subjectivity, I have a kind of inherent capacity and facility to collaborate with others. And so there is something, right? I treat other people as ends in themselves. That's already, in a way, helping other people, at least in the sense that I'm compelled not to hinder and constrain others in their pursuit of goals. And so, right, helping others is already we're already walking down that road. It's an imperfect duty because I cannot make that duty universal. I can't always, at every time and every place, be helping others. I have to be helping myself at certain times, right? There are other things that I have to be doing. I can't also be helping all people at all times. So it can't be universalized in the same way. And so it won't be a perfect duty. The same is true of perfecting my talents, right? Self-development. I can't always be developing myself, educating myself, improving myself in whatever way, right? It's not realistic to always, in every case, be doing that. And so it can only be an imperfect duty. Now, I think that sounds reasonable enough. But it's interesting, right? This idea of helping others is only an imperfect duty. And it ties into Kant's idea of the autonomous rational agent, right? I also can't have a duty to help others because others are their own agents. Other people have the capacity and power to help themselves. And so at a certain point, by helping others, I am taking away from them by preventing them from being fully autonomous. So, I think, again, it's rational, this argument. But we have to wonder, does this de-incentivize helping others? Is Kant's entire rational moral structure here really the most ethical one if it doesn't demand that we help others? So it's a question. But I think we can see structurally why Kant would say these are imperfect duties. Okay. So let's think about these perfect duties. And what Kant really means by this. Kant is extremely strict about the categorical imperative. And he says it must always be followed. Now, a friend of Kant's, his name escapes me at the moment, wrote Kant a letter about these perfect duties, about the categorical imperative, and presented him with a hypothetical scenario. And he asks, right, imagine that a friend comes to you and says, a murderer is pursuing me. I need a place to hide. And you say, of course, you can hide in my basement. Right? Friend goes in the basement. Next day, the murderer knocks on your door and says, hey, I'm looking for your friend. I wonder if you've seen your friend around. And Kant's friend, who asks this question or poses this scenario, asks, in this situation, would the person be obliged? Would it be a perfect duty to tell the murderer that you have been housing this friend that they want to murder? Right? Would it be immoral to lie to a murderer who wants to kill your friend in order to protect your friend? Kant's answer is yes, you have to tell the murderer the truth. You cannot lie to the murderer. Right? Why? Because the consequences don't matter. Because no goal or purpose is truly moral. The only question is, have you followed the categorical imperative? So in this case, right, obviously lying goes against the categorical imperative, but you'd also be treating the murderer as a means to your own end. You'd be deceiving them in order to protect your friend. So this is quite extreme and illustrates the extent to which morality runs counter to your self-interest and your goals. All right, so let's leave it there. I'm gonna include a little video for you to watch to go along with this, so that'll make up our additional 10 minutes here. And we'll pick this up on Monday and talk about some of these issues again. And also we'll think about the purpose of the moral law, right? What is the purpose here? All right. See you then.